In today's video I will assemble and paint Corvus Belli's brand new WARCROW Starter Set, The Winds from the North. Well, at least the orc half, because I will split the other half into a second video coming next week. So today we will focus on the northern tribes, but if you want to see the hegemony models painted, then you only need to wait a few days before I upload that as well. Hey guys, I'm Zoltan and you're watching PHLANSMINIATURE. At this point you might be asking yourself what WARCROW is, and the answer is that it's a fantasy-themed miniature skirmish game from Corvus Belli, the creators of Infinity. And the Winds from the North starter set launched a few weeks ago, and it has some gorgeous miniatures in the box split between the northern tribes, basically the local orcs, and the hegemony, one of the human factions in the setting. To be honest, I'm a bit late to the party with this video because when the guys from Corvus Belli sent the box to me, I was in the middle of moving house and countries, so there is already plenty of content out there with unboxings, rule reviews, and about the setting from other content creators. So instead of focusing on that, in this video I will show you how you can paint up the models to something that resembles the box art quite closely, but without spending a lifetime doing it. I will be spending around 7-8 hours painting each faction, and I will show you step by step how you can achieve a similar result in about the same time using only a brush, some contrast paints, and some regular acrylic colors for the highlights. And I will go step by step, so if you want to make it faster and leave out a few steps, you can do that too. And by the way, there are 7 models in the box per faction, and it took me about 2.5 hours cleaning and assembling them all. That is actually quite a lot for this many models, so be prepared that you will spend a little more than usual on removing mod lines and possibly even on a little gap filling with milliput before you can start painting. But fortunately, the beautiful sculpts make the pain of the assembly absolutely worth it. Once I had the models assembled, I primed them in a dark red color, but a simple black would also work perfectly fine, and the difference will be negligible in the end. What can I say, I like to be a bit fancy with my undercoats. Since I wanted to use contrast paints to speed up the painting process, I needed a bright zenithal on top of that red, or black if that's what you used. Contrast paints need a close to white undercoat to be effective, but by leaving the red in the shadows I will create even more contrast and some interesting transitions that I couldn't get with just a simple white undercoat and contrast paints alone. As the first real step in the painting process, I used an airbrush to apply my Zenithal highlights, which will be the last time I'll be using an airbrush in this video, by the way, just saying before you guys run away on me. But you could also apply it with a spray can. And I have a video about Zenithal priming on the channel, by the way, if you would like to learn how to do it well, so check that out. As you can see, I used a pretty heavy white coat from the top, concentrating especially around the torso and the head of the mini, where most of the attention of the viewer will be centered. But if you turn the model on its head, you can still see the dark red undercoat. Now that we have all the models primed and Zenithal highlighted, it's time for the fun step, which is to apply all the base coats with contrast paints. And there are 2 main reasons for using contrast paints for this step. The first and most obvious one is that they are way faster to apply. To give you an idea, it took me 30 minutes or so to finish the first 2 models I painted, but that included selecting the colors as well. By the time I painted the last 2 characters, I had that time down to around 15 minutes. And on top of being fast, it also allows me to skip the shading step in the miniature painting process, since the nature of contrast paints combined with the Zenithal highlight creates enough shading for our needs. Adding some highlights and effects on top of this in the highlighting stage creates enough contrast on the mini that we don't need to increase it even further by shading, and with that we can shave off quite a bit of time in our painting. But before we can do that, the most important thing is to find the right colors for the most important elements of the figures, especially those that are shared among all the models in the faction, so that you can create a coherent look. And in the northern tribes, those are obviously the skins, since they are all orcs, and the armor, the bone and leather bits, as well as the weapons. My wife will put those colors for you on the screen while she's editing the video, so I can talk about the best way to use them. The trick is to change your mindset from painting with normal acrylics. Instead of lots of thin layers, you want to have one layer that spreads around the whole surface. You don't want to slowly spread it around with the brush, instead you want to have enough on the brush to cover everything all at once, or at least before the part you applied first starts drying. Just be careful not to flood the entire surface, of course. And for this you need a nice big brush, but ideally with a decent tip. I painted the first 2 models with an older frayed brush, and it worked, but it led to more mistakes than necessary, so I switched to a sharper one soon after. Speaking of mistakes, that also needs a mindset change. When I paint a single mini to a high standard, I will try to avoid mistakes like the plague. But if I want to really take advantage of contrast paints, I need to accept that the end result won't be perfect. And that is fine as long as there are not too many big mistakes. I still want to be reasonably neat, but only as long as I don't need to sacrifice too much speed for it. But you can also avoid some mistakes by being methodical. For example, it's good practice to start with elements that are deeper on the model. For example, paint the skin first and then the clothes and the armor that the character is wearing on the skin. This way the already painted elements won't be in your way and there is less chance of hitting them with another color. Another important thing when painting some elements that are adjacent to each other is to wait until one dries before you paint the other. If you don't, the two paints might touch and run into each other. You know how you are not supposed to cross the beams in Ghostbusters? That applies here as well. Finally, don't try to paint tiny details with contrast paints at this stage, that will just lead to more mistakes. For example, you don't have to paint the buckles on the leather straps at this point. You can simply paint them a leather color and you can either pick out the details during the highlighting stage or choose to leave them as is if you want to go for a faster but simpler result. By the way, all the colors on this list are quite straightforward and require mostly one coat, but two of them are a little special, the light blue and the bone color. The bone one is just a little weak and it's up to you how dark you want the bones to be, so you can go with 1 or 2 coats and I prefer 2. But the Briar Queen Chill is a little tricky to work with, so that needs at least 2 coats. And be careful not to flood the model with it because it tends to flow better than the other contrast paints for some reason. And something to note, for the weapons I used Black Legion, which is essentially a pure black because later I will do a simple non-metallic metal similar to the box art and the black will serve as a base coat, but if you want to use normal metallics, the black undercoat will still serve you well. On top of the big obvious bits, there are some other colors on these models as well, with some of them unique to the hero characters. For the hair I decided to go with red for one of the Orc Huntresses and later repainted the other one as well, just like the leader character who also has red hair and beard. It is probably less than lore accurate, but in my head the 2 Huntresses are his daughters, hence the same colored hair, and the 2 Hunters are their suitors who want to impress the father in battle or something like that. Not sure who the big bone-covered dude, the wise man, is in this scenario, but maybe he's the big scary uncle protecting his nieces. The Wrathmane, or the father in my little headcanon, also has a torn and somewhat ratty cape that I painted with rattling grime, which seemed to be a good match. Finally, the Evoker, the shaman-looking lady orc with a lot more exposed skin than you would first notice, has quite a few unique colors on her as well. Initially I wanted to wet blend the blue to purple transition on her upper robe with some Croxigor scales and some purple contrast, but I ended up not liking the results, so I repainted it with pure Croxigor scales in the end. Her hair got a coat of Azurman blue to make it nice and vibrant, and for the evil magic flame coming out of the skull on her belt and coiling around her arm, I also painted the area around the flame with red for a basis for a very simple OSL effect later down the line. And that is all the contrast painting done. It took me 2 hours and 50 minutes of painting time based on the recorded footage to paint the 7 models, so around 25 minutes per model. Some people might be happy to leave them at this stage to start playing as soon as possible, but we can make them look much better with some highlighting. The nice thing is that already at this stage everything is covered with color, so only after a couple of hours of painting you could start playing with them and later you could decide to highlight them further whenever you feel like it. But I know myself, if I leave them like this, I will move on to other projects and these guys will never get finished, so let's move on to the highlighting phase in our process. I used a simple rule for all the elements. I used 2 highlight colors for each, a darker one that could be used to correct some mistakes and create some subtle highlights, and one that is quite bright to do some really punchy high contrast highlights. These guys are meant to look good on a table, so the final highlight needs to stand out quite a bit to create a lot of contrast. Instead of going one by one like with the contrast paints, this time I painted all the same elements on all the models before moving on to another one, and I started with the skin. I used the frog green to correct any bigger mistakes on the skin and to highlight the most raised parts. Then, since I couldn't find the appropriate color, I mixed some ice yellow into the frog green to punch higher with the highlights. And don't worry, this will be the only mixed color, and further on there will be specific colors for all the highlights. Finding the right spots to highlight is quite easy since the contrast paint and the Zenithal combo shows highlights quite clearly, and now our job is to emphasize them more. You simply paint the first highlight inside the highlight the contrast left behind, but without covering the contrast color fully. And then you repeat the same thing with the second highlight, but now inside the first highlight. As a rule of thumb, it's good practice to use quite diluted colors to do this since otherwise the paint will stand out a lot on the contrast painted surface. Painting the lips and the tribal scars some of the hunters have is quite easy since they are somewhat raised, so you can just run the side of the brush along them most of the time. And where that doesn't work, you can trace them with the tip. Next, I moved on to all the things I painted black previously, and I used the same colors for all of them regardless of whether it was covered in Black Templar or Black Legion. The armor is quite straightforward. All the trim and the ornaments are raised, so it's easy to trace the whole thing with the first highlight color, and then only the parts that should be hit the most with the light with the second highlight. But the weapons are a bit trickier. The original box art has them painted in non-metallic metal, and that is what I chose as well, or at least a simplified version of it. But you can also just cover these in traditional metal colors and apply a wash and some simple highlights with a lighter metal. But if you want to follow my example with the non-metallic metal, the easiest way is for me to show it on the X on the big hunter dude. I divided the weapon into two parts, basically the cutting edge and the rest, and painted all the edges on both. The upper part I left quite dark, but started painting small chips and scratches on it, concentrating more of them on the upper part of this darker area. But on the cutting edge I created a big highlight to make it look way brighter than the top. Then with the next highlight color I painted more scratches on the top, but concentrating them on the upper part of the X even more, and then I continued making the middle of the big highlight bigger and brighter. If you have the time, you can make this fancier by glazing over the top with the highlight color, integrating the scratches into the surface, and by glazing different colors like a yellow and a turquoise, for example, next to the big highlight on the cutting edge. But for now, let's move on to the pants and the skirts, the bits where we use the Briar Queen shell. Creating a nice seamless transition on big surfaces is not something we have time for in this project, so we will go for something much simpler that will still give us a lot of contrast and visual interest on the tabletop, and we will do it with a single color. Remember how we did the scratches on the metal on the upper part of the blade just before? Now I did the same thing on the pants and the skirts. This makes the material look worn and highlights it at the same time. The trick is to not go overboard and try to keep the scratches nice and thin. Some quick movements with a nice sharp brush will do the trick. Just make sure that the paint flows nicely as well, the same consistency you would use for edge highlighting. If you haven't tried this before, you can practice on a piece of paper. If you can make the lines thin there, you can also do it on the model. As an added bonus, you can also use this color to highlight the metals we just did further if you have the time and patience for it. But you can also use the same method on the bones as well, but instead of random scratches, now we are doing some long thin lines along the bones. It is a good idea to designate one end of the horn to be darker. It doesn't really matter which end it is, but it will make them look more interesting. Another thing you can do once you are done with the highlights is to use a glaze of the original skeleton horde contrast and drag it towards the end that you want to be darker. This creates a nice light to dark transition, integrates the scratches you created and brings back the rich color that was lost with the highlighting. Just brace yourself for painting all the bones that the wise man is wearing. That dude looks like a paleontologist's wet dream and your worst nightmare if you don't like to highlight bone. For the leather elements, the most important thing is to edge highlight everything. If you manage to highlight all the edges, it will already look good. And if you want to go one step further, then you can create scratches going across the straps from one edge to the other. For all the tactical rocks these guys are standing on, and there are a lot of them, I used a single color to overbrush some of their edges and raise the elements a bit. For the hero characters, you can mix in some ice yellow into the gray to highlight them a little more. Now we are quite close to the finish line. We mostly just have a couple of unique elements on some of the hero models left. On the fur coat of the Wrathmane and some of the other fur elements on the other models, I used some off-white and mostly used the side of the brush to highlight the raised hair tufts. In some places it's good practice to trace some of the tufts with the tip of the brush to add some more precise detail. It is also important to focus the highlights on the top of the elements where they would be more hit by the light. This helps create more contrast on an object that is not very contrasty otherwise. For example, I highlighted the shoulder of the leader way more than the bit of the fur that was hanging further down. This makes the top look lighter and the bottom darker. For the shafts of the weapons and the big nasty looking club the wise man is carrying around to discipline the suitors, I used the same technique we used for the bones, but changed the color to something more desaturated. We are aiming for long vertical scratches to imitate a wood grain effect. For all the red hair in the Wrathmane's family, I highlighted with some red and then with some orange mixed in. The cape of the Wrathmane is quite a big surface and it looks quite rough painted with contrast paints. At first I tried medium sea grey, but it wasn't a good color match, so I switched to deck tan. At this point you should be an expert in scratches, so it's time to put those skills to good use and make a lot more scratches. And if you think it looks quite bad, then paint a wash of Agara's Dune's contrast over it and watch it transform into a quite decent looking leather cape. At this point, if you are crazy like me, you can paint some even smaller elements like some orc nails and some effects on the idols the evoker is standing on. Or you can finish the highlighting phase with the truly important stuff, the eyes for example. These are actually quite easy since they are neatly sculpted onto the models. You simply paint the whole eye and a little bit around it black, and then when it's dry you carefully paint the little raised eyeball inside the socket with off-white. Once that dried, you paint 2 or 3 layers of orange fluorescent paint over the white part, giving them those dreamy red eyes the northern tribes are famous for. For the inside of the mouth you simply need some Sigwald burgundy contrast, and if you feel up for it you can also drop a tiny bit between the lip and the teeth to separate them more. And then you can use the usual bone colors to pick out the fangs, and believe it or not, we are done with the highlights. Not gonna lie, I was a little exhausted after all this highlighting, but I still had a little bit of energy left for adding a couple of tufts on the base and to spread some snow texture to complete the winter environment. I painted the base rims black as is proper and then called it a day, and the end result looks like this. It took me a total of 8.5 hours to paint all the orcs, which is a little slower than what I planned, but you should be able to do it even faster since I spent a lot of time figuring things out, which you don't have to do after having watched this video. But what do you guys think? Do you like the result for the time invested? Let me know in the comments. And keep an eye out for the second part of the video about the human side of the box coming in the next couple of days. Thank you very much for watching, and if you like the content, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons. See you guys in the next one.